So welcome everyone today to our open duet session between Diane Roussin from Winnipeg Boldness Project and David Robinson from the Relationship Project. My name is So Jung Rim, and I'm the COO of SIX. SIX is a social innovation exchange built on mutual value and relationships. And we work globally to facilitate purposeful cross-sector conversations that challenge and inspire people. And at the core of our value is this mutual exchange and learning from different contexts. And today's conversation is happening as part of our SIX Wayfinder program, which is about thinking about the future of social innovation. And we started this journey in 2017 in London. And this year we were supposed to have a two-day event in Canada, but this year turned out to be very different. So we really had to think differently about how we organize the events, and we kind of structured the two-day event into kind of a 6-month journey inspired by music. And the first movement was around tuning, where we listened to the stories around the world. And now we are at the end of our second movement, Ensembling, which is all about creating meaningful relationships and connecting people across sector and borders. Today, I'm really humbled to be part of open duet session titled Change Moves at the Speed of Trust, the Value and Loss of Relationships in Today's Global Society. And we have two fantastic contributors joining us. Joining me from Manitoba, Canada is Diane Roussin, who is the project director of Winnipeg Boldness Project, an ambitious social innovation initiative seeking to create large-scale systems change for children and families in a local neighborhood. Diane's project is about centering and documenting Indigenous wisdom, ways of knowing, being, feeling, and doing, and by going deep into the community. Also joining me from London is David Robinson. David is a community worker in East London. He has founded and led many organizations such as Community Links, Children's Discovery Center, and Changing London. And recently, as part of Shift, David has started the Relationship Project with a mission to make it easier for every organization and services and places to put relationships at the heart of what they do. So I would like to start the conversation by kind of placing us in the context. As many of our audience members are coming from different places around the world and not aware of your work, I would like to start the conversation by asking Diane and David to share where you're coming from, the context that has shaped you, who you are, and how it has influenced your work. So Diane, we'll start with you.
Okay, Anine, Buzu, so happy to be here having this conversation. I am, as you said, in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada right now. And a thing that we like to do in Canada is acknowledge the land that we're on and the relationship we have with that land and with the water around us. And so we acknowledge the people that were here and have been living and caring for this land, living on and caring for this land for a really long time, which is our Indigenous populations. And so I am right now situated on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, the Cree, the Oji Cree, the Dene, and the Dakota people. And this is also the homeland of the Métis Nation. And our Métis leaders and nations have really formed Manitoba and, you know, as part of Canada. So we do the land acknowledgements to, again, acknowledge the folks that were here before and who really helped, you know, make Canada what it is, like in the past, as well as currently and into the future. And we talk about the numbered treaties because the treaties represent the understanding that when folks came here from outside of Canada, we weren't Canada at the time, but when settlers came here, that the treaty signified the kind of relationship that we wanted to have with one another and how we were going to be together on this land. So that's why in Trinity, I personally am Anishinaabe, and I am from the Treaty 2 territory, which is about 3.5 hours north of here. That's where my mom and dad are from. My mom is from Skownan First Nation, and that's where I get my nationhood. And my dad was a very active in the Métis Nation. He was Métis, he's passed away now. So I think I come into this conversation about relationships very much because of my Anishinaabe heritage, in terms of the kinds of values and principles that are centered in my culture, and that I've, again, had the privilege of living with my whole life. There's been the whole colonization catastrophe that happened here in Canada. Many Indigenous people were taken away and removed from their culture and heritage and language and values and principles, and so they did not have the privilege of growing up with them, many of us. And so I always feel entirely grateful that I was able to grow up with it all and have moved into a career as an adult and been able to center those values and principles in my career as well. So as an Indigenous person, I've always known that there's all these complex, wicked challenges. We like to talk about that a lot in social innovation world or in society. And so trying to figure out, and so I spent my whole career trying to figure out how to address those complex challenges, primarily for Indigenous people. The early parts of my career was very much about Indigenous people. And while I still am very focused on helping Indigenous people, I think the solutions that we're trying to generate are good for all people. And I had said in an earlier conversation a couple of months ago, those solutions are also good for the whole planet. And because one of the Indigenous knowledge systems is all my relations. And all my relations means we are all super interconnected. And we talk about Mother Earth and Father Sky and Grandmother Moon, and these are all our relations. And so the trees, the water, the land, those are all our relations. And we have to, another saying we use in Anishinaabe is pimadaziwin, which is the good life. And the good life is about trying to be in balance with all my relations. And so, we don't talk about trying to control the water or manage the water. We talk about being in good relationship with the water, and that's good for the water and it's good for humans as well. So and so that's all about relationship for me, like recognizing how interconnected we are and recognizing when we're striving to be in good relationship with one another, how that benefits all of us, and it really leads to good like health and wellness outcomes for all my relations. And so that's the work of Winnipeg Boldness. And I just want to do a little shout out. I see Gladys is on here, and she walked with us in the early days of Boldness and has moved down south now, but was really key in helping us write down these ways these knowledge systems that I'm talking about. So that's sort of my work, trying to figure out how to solve complex challenges. And I know we'll go to David here right away, but I feel like centering Indigenous wisdom in trying to solve for complex challenges has not really happened a lot by and large in this country, in Canada. And so I feel like it's a very much an untapped potential. And I feel, if we delve into many of these knowledge systems that we have, it would go a long way in helping us to address these complex challenges that we're facing today, and whether they be environment or whether they be COVID or whether they be, just issues around justice or social justice and what have you. And I think maybe sometimes what is the opposite of relationship helps clarify what we mean by that. I feel like by and large, mainstream society is set up for transactionality. Sort of our serving systems or our knowledge systems really centered transaction. And so that's, the concepts of time, the concepts of efficiency. And I think when we center relationship, that's a different sense of time. And we end up, I feel like, developing much deeper trust levels when it's relationship driven versus transactionally driven. And when you have that trust in place, to me, that builds a super strong foundation that allows us to move into complexity in a better way. And it allows us to deal with complexity in a better way. And I just know my personal experience with strong, trusting people around me. We go deep and we go fast into that complexity, and we get it figured out actually in a fairly decent speed. So this, the building of the relationship and the trust takes time, but when it's there, we can move so quick into solving the complex things. So that's sort of some opening comments, and I'll stop there and hear what David has to say.
Thank you, Diane. David.
Well, that's such a powerful place to finish, Diana. I think that all my life I've been trying to figure out trust and power alongside relationships, and perhaps we'll come back to that in a moment. But my story is I'm sat here in East London, a rather chilly and locked down London at the moment, and it's broadly where I've lived all my life. East London, when I was growing up, was, and still is to some extent, one of the poorest parts of the UK. So we were at the bottom of all the league tables that you don't want to be at the bottom of. And some of us at that time, at school at that time, bought an old double-decker bus, a very old double-decker bus, and we took out the seats and we got some play equipment and some art equipment and so on. And we got a rota of bus drivers from the local bus garage because we were too young to drive this thing. And they used to take it round to different sites in Docklands and elsewhere across East London evenings and weekends. And we used to run children's and youth activities on and around the bus. In these days of much greater compliance, I don't know who would close us down first if we tried to do that again now. But at the time it was very popular, and we get 120, 140 kids at those sessions. But I think one of the big takeaways, big learnings for me from that work a long, long time ago, was that we were working with young people, certainly who were experiencing really quite brutal material poverty. But there was also something that I began to think about as relational poverty. So they had very few or very limited relationships with really anybody much older than themselves. And because they didn't have those relationships, they probably didn't have particularly good relationships with their peers either. And I began to see how that had an impact on their networks, on their knowledge of the world, and consequently on their self-respect, their self-esteem, and their confidence. And I guess the learning from all that was has figured pretty big in my life since then, when I have continued, that work evolved into Community Links, which is the community development agency that I've been associated with most of my working life since then, and the various projects that I've been engaged in subsequently. And I think that the more I reflect on what I guess now is a sort of 40+ year journey, the more I think that relationships are the key theme running through it all. Although that was not a sort of a deliberate plan at the beginning, I just reflect back, and I think where and when we get relationships right, we are on the way to solving a lot of other problems. And to pick up to end where Diane ended, I think trust is absolutely a critical point, a part of that. How do we build trusting and meaningful relationships with one another, and where and when we get that right, whether it is in the micro, in our relationships with one another, or whether it's between governments and nation states. It's exactly the same sort of issue.
Thank you both. And I wanted to kind of touch upon a point where kind of why this is happening. Kind of Diane, you talked about being in good balance and good relationship with all my relations. David, you talk about kind of how this kind of connection and relationship is increasingly designed out of our society and services and places that we live in. Why is this happening, and why is it so hard for our contemporary society to kind of embrace this relationship-based approach? David, do you want to start? Well,
lots of reasons. But I think I'd start with three. I think ideological influences certainly from 1940s onwards have driven us towards a politics that is all about self-interest and competition. And I think that has not only influenced the way government does its business and the way the public realm operates, but I think it has also bled into popular culture, whether we're looking at reality TV or FOMO on social media or wherever we go, we see that sort of competitive instinct playing out. And I think that has, as I said, bled across from management of the economy and management of statecraft through into to popular culture. I think the second big influence running alongside that has been the development of our technological capability. Social media would be part of that, the ease with which we can have this kind of conversation, but also the technological development in, for instance, healthcare, meaning that there is a case for efficiency in building big units rather than small localized units. Lots of good things have come out of that technological capability, but there is also a downside to that, a dark side, and a dark side which I think has left a lot of people far behind. And the third thing I would suggest is that possibly as a consequence of the first two, that we have developed organizational models and protocols, whether it's small organizations or very big ones, models and protocols that play to that idea of individualism and self-interest. And I think there is a lot of good stuff wrapped up in all that, but as has often been the case in human history, I think social behavior has not kept up with technological progress. And what we find now, I think, is a caravan, a bit like we find in material poverty, where the camels crossing the desert and the camels at the front end of the caravan now so far ahead of those at the back that it ceases to be one caravan, ceases to be one society. And I think that's what where we are now, that relationships are broken down. And in the United Kingdom, we talk about left behind communities. I think what we're seeing perhaps played out in the States at the moment is cries for help from communities that similarly feel they're unnoticed. And these, I think, are the consequences of the three trends and much, much more that I talked about. But that's a very simple answer to a very complex question.
Thank you. Diane, how about you? Why is it so hard to?
I think that, I mean, we can go way back to, there was the Big Bang and then the dinosaurs came. I mean, we could go back there. I think that right now, Western paradigms are dominant, and, the whole phenomena of colonization across this world and sort of that, if you want to call that a business model in terms of expanding out to all these different lands across the world and to sort of extract and bring those resources back to mothership or whatever. And then, the whole industrial complex kinds of thinking. For me, those Western paradigms look like a triangle. And so that's when I say they're, sort of, it's based on authority, it's based on the same, it's based on, power at the top, and everybody else just follows suit all the way to the bottom. And it's how we made cars, like the Model T car. Like, we wanted the tires to be the same, and we wanted the widget to be the same, and the thing to be the same. So we as we advanced in society, we use those same systems for humans, and humans are not. We're so unique and so different. We're not standardized, or we're not. So I think the mainstream systems are based on and center values and principles that don't necessarily work well for humans. And I was listening to what David was talking about there, and I feel like when we center different principles, the Western ones become very obvious to us. And so in order to center trust, I feel like it opens up space for a lot of different ways of being that a mainstream Western paradigm does not allow for. So it allows for, you're just listening to the story about the double-decker bus. I love that. I think when we have trust and relationships, we can move to values-based kinds of operating and decision-making. And so it's not the rules-based and let's shut that down because that's breaking a rule, versus is this important and why is this important versus, oh, let's just follow the rules and the rules say no double decker bus. And so it also opens up space, I think, for this concept of co-creation and interconnectedness. And it opens up space for, like, again, when that trust is really good, it opens up space for like risk taking and experimenting. And it opens up space for like intuition and emergence and iteration. And mainstream systems lock all that stuff down, right? Like, they don't like mainstream sort of, you know, that triangle does not like, you know, risky stuff or unknown things or emergence, you know, or unplanned kinds of, you know, sort of, I mean, even chaos theory will say that pattern eventually emerges, right? You just have to trust that that's going to happen. And so I think mainstream systems really are siloed and they want to be like independent, like they really center independence. And our Anishinaabe knowledge teachings are very much in a circle. And so there is a time and a place to learn and be independent, but it isn't the pinnacle. The real pinnacle is interdependence. And so, you know, so we sort of associate independence with youth, but we associate the, you know, the learnings of interdependence in more maturity and eldership, right? So so that's what we're always to be moving towards, is this interdependence. And the other thing I wanted to say, just a little bit of what David was saying there about personal relationships. Again, I feel, you know, Indigenous knowledge systems, we have 7 natural ways of healing. And, you know, we talk a lot about how healing is just an ongoing way of being. Like it's this Minnow pimadaziwin I was just talking about, this constant pursuit of the good life, which is, in my mind, it's just constant healing. And those good, solid relationships, I feel like, address basic safety, security, you know, things in humans. And when you have that, I think it just leads to a lot more kind of peace and nurturing and healing in individuals. And so when you hear a poverty of relationships, like, that just breaks my heart to think that that people have a poverty of personal relationships. But yeah, so I think, you know, again, I kind of go back to these complex systems that are in place right now that really aren't serving many of us as humans very well. If, you know, they were set up to like build cars, but humans, you know, demand customization, I think, and instead of a standardization. And a lot of the work we do at Boldness, a lot of the community wisdom that's coming forward tells us that, you know, the work is really in the work of equity. Like, we got to do a lot of work in the equity space to get to that equality space. Whereas I think mainstream systems just want to focus on equality, and that's that standardization. Everybody gets the same, whether you need it or not, and whether it's working for you or not. So yeah,
Great.
so that's where that took me.
Thank you. So what kind of, what can you tell to people who are trying to embrace this approach? Like, could you give us some tips on how to start this kind of relationship, how to put relationship the focus of your work and your services and the way you work? How could we do it well? Could you tell us about kind of your approach? Diane, do you want to start?
Sure. I mean, I think so. Just start, I think is part of it. And I think that, you know, knowing that it isn't always up to you to solve the problem. It's not always up to you to determine the problem, and it's not always up to you to solve the problem. One of the things I see a lot in Canada with Indigenous people, a lot of the challenges facing Indigenous people, many non-Indigenous people who want to be entirely helpful and have the greatest of intentions, want to define the problem and then right away jump to the solution finding and wanting to fix and you know, ameliorate. So I think it's knowing that we have to be in relationship, and that it's in that relationship we can do the defining of the problem, and then we can like figure out way better solutions to those challenges when we have a set of relationships. So to me, it's being super aware of who's in the room. Like, that's where I start. It's like, whoever's in the room is where to start. that group will always figure out the rest. But if some of us aren't in the room, we don't even get to have a conversation about what we think the issue is. So that's a starting place, a basic starting place for me, is look around who's in the room. And if the right, if I shouldn't say the right people, it's maybe not the right language. You know, if there isn't a good diversity of people in the room, you know, I think we need to strive to have a lot more of those unique and diverse voices. And I feel like as a society, we really are comfortable with what's the same and what brings us together and how we're the same. And so it's great that we do that. But I feel like as a society, we don't do so well in our difference. Somehow that our difference is the thing that, our difference is seen as a thing that divides us, when I think our difference is a thing that can, our difference is a thing that can take us further, you know, because we bring such unique things to the table. And if we can, you know, tap into all those unique pieces of each of us, that just takes us all further.
Thank you, Diane. David, where do we start with this relationship approach?
I dropped out for a moment there, so I don't know what happened there, but what was the question? I'm sorry.
Oh,
where do you start? Right.
And what approach have you taken?
Well, I think, first of all, recognizing that being well connected is not the same as connecting well. So having lots of links on our address book is an entirely different thing from having meaningful relationships. And I think trying to think through how would our place change if relationships were the central operating principle. And when I say our place, I think we can each define that for ourselves. We might define it differently. So it might be, in your case, Dan, perhaps the organization that you run. It might be the classroom that you teach in or that you are a student in. It might be the neighborhood that you live in, a small team that you're a part of. It could be completely different interpretation each time. But how would that place change if relationships were that central operating principle? Let me give you an example of both where it doesn't work and where it might. So in the education system in the UK, policy tends to be made from the top down. So departments talk about what they expect of schools to achieve. We have an inspection regime that holds them to account. Those instructions are filtered down from government through local authorities, through what we call academy chains in some cases, through head teachers, eventually through to the teacher in the classroom, and then finally through to the child. Suppose we thought about how planning and development in the school began the other way around, and we recognize that none of that is going to work if the relationship between the teacher and the child and other children in the classroom, and the school and the family, if that is either broken or flawed in some way, none of that is going to work. So we start off by thinking, how do we build strong relationships within the classroom, child to child, teacher to child, teacher to home, and then we build out from that. That isn't to say that the examination performance, the standards, all the rest of it is unimportant. What it is to recognize is that we're not going to achieve any of that if we haven't got the relationships right in the first place. So how does our classroom change if relationships are the central operating principle? And how does our school change? And part of what we've been doing with the Relationships Project is developing that into a very simple 5-step process. But we can do that for ourselves. Just applying that challenge, I think, is the important place to start.
Okay, thank you. Audience members, please feel free to write your questions on the Q&A section. We'll shortly address your questions as well. But before we go into audience Q&A, my last question is, like, in this kind of polarizing society, how do you kind of be in good relation with people that you fundamentally disagree with? Because so we've seen kind of US elections this week, and Diane, you talk about kind of being in good relationship with nature as well. But how do you view disasters and even coronavirus? What kind of relationship should we build in the negative, and how do we build? How do we view the other? Diane, could I start with you?
Yeah, and I tend to, I wrote down, as David was talking, I wrote down, you know, again, thinking inside the circle, which is something I say a lot. And so my thinking is very circular. And when I think about, you know, tension or conflict or anything like that, I go back to, you know, we do need to be in good, solid relationships with each other, because when we are, we can have the most difficult conversations ever. And just again, personally, I'm sure we've all experienced this, where when you're, whether it's your friend or your partner or whoever, when you're in super good relationship, you give each other lots of space. You're patient, you hear each other out, you try to understand each other, even if you have differing opinions about things. You know, you know that what's important is the person and not the idea, but you can have difficult conversations about the idea, knowing that at the end of the day, what's important is you and me, and that will always prevail. And so, and I joke a little bit to say, you know, when you're in those good relationships and you say some dumb stuff, I mean, I say dumb stuff all the time. And so, you know, when that dumb stuff falls out of my mouth, you know, people who really care for me will go, okay, that was pretty dumb and you shouldn't have done that. And here's why, you know, and they just hold you differently, or they hold you in a good way when you slip up like that. When you're in a bad relationship, I mean, you can just sort of look sideways at somebody and they will go off. Like it'll be a nuclear war, because they want to know, why did you look at them like that when you just looked at them sideways like that? And so you back up and go, I wasn't looking at you, and so on and so forth. But that's just an example of when the relationships are bad, how you just can't get anywhere with anything. And the littlest thing sets off like a war. Whereas when it's in a really good, you can just get into those difficult conversations. So, you know, and then that leads us to the conversation about, well, how do you form good relationships, right? And that's a whole other conversation. And David's been saying a lot about that too. And so I think there's that. And then I think when we are hit with some serious stuff, like, you know, what's going on with the environment, like COVID, like others, I think how we receive those challenges and then how we try to solve for those challenges is different if we center relationship driven approaches versus, say, transactional types of approaches. I think relationality really does understand or helps us to better understand interconnectedness. So, you know, who knew? I don't know how, I would say, I don't know how big COVID is. It's like a little thing that we can't see. And something that small is having this kind of effect on the planet. And so that is a teaching in interconnectedness, if I ever heard one. You know, and so if we understand it that way, does it change how we're trying to solve for it or how we're trying to deal with it? You know, and I feel like, you know, in the absence of a vaccine at this point, this is all relational now, right? Like we're all very mindful of how we connect and when we connect and where we, you know, like this is all now about how we're in relationship with each other in terms of how does COVID, you know, get a foothold in us or not. So.
Great, thank you. David.
I think this COVID year has been the best of times and the worst of times, and certainly lockdown in the spring in the UK introduced us to the idea of mutual aid, and about 20%, 17% in fact of UK adults were involved in supporting others in ways that they had never done before. And I think that those who have studied responses to disasters in other parts of the world at other times would say that that was part of a pattern which, in that sort of honeymoon period of positivity, then over time it gives way to a period of disillusionment, and also to what we have seen really since August in the UK, which is that very strong emergence of bonding capital, bonding with people quite close to us or similar to us, not diminishing, but growing up alongside that, a breaking down of the bridges, so the connections between those tight groups and others close to them, or perhaps in many cases very similar to them. I think that's what we've seen very clearly over the last couple of months in the UK, those bridges breaking down. And the learning from that, looking at disasters in other places and those that respond to it, is that the first thing you really need to do is to name it, to acknowledge that that is what is going on. And a meaningful conversation cannot take place if you're both sides are trying to pretend that that's not really happening. So an adult conversation begins by naming the difficulty. And then I think the second element of all this is really listening hard, not coming in with that immediate solution. And perhaps what we see being played out in the States at the moment is a consequence of not listening over a sustained period of time. And when we are not listened to, then we talk a bit louder. And if we're still not listened to, we shout. And when we're not listened to, even when we're shouting, we get very, very angry. And to a certain extent, we've seen that in the UK with what we now talk about as left behind communities with rather patronizing language. But if there's a common thread in all this, it is that we are not in the first instance naming the issue that is dividing us and not listening to one another. So those would be the two things that I would talk about. And then I think it takes us right back to where we began in this conversation, that when you've done both of those things, you begin to build trust. So we don't necessarily agree about the solution, we don't agree about the way forward, but we can nonetheless still build a solid relationship.
And before we go into the audience questionnaire, I wanted to see if you have questions for each other. Diane, do you have a question for David at this point?
Well, I mean, again, I'm just super fascinated with lots of what David is saying. So I don't know if I can put David on the spot and see if he has a question as I'm formulating my thoughts here.
I think my question would be, what I'm thinking about a lot at the moment is what makes us optimistic and hopeful. It's pretty in our face what in the world at the moment there is to be a bit miserable about on a day-to-day basis and also looking forward. But I think as community work without optimism is like a plumber without having a toolbox. You really can't do the job, can you? So what is it that makes you optimistic and positive?
Well, I feel like I was, again, raised with lots of optimism. I was raised with a real mentality of resilience and a real mentality of gratitude teachings, like just being grateful for what we do have. And so I think those things all, contribute to this optimism. Currently, again, in the face of all these complex challenges that society's facing, I do work in an inner city area where the families and children that I see, it's criminal, the kinds of challenges that they face. And it really angers me when I see that they have to go through that and they shouldn't have to. But they do. And they do it with such grace, and they do it with such tenacity, and they do it with such love, because really most families, I think, are trying to make it better for their kids, right? Mm-hmm. And so they do it with all of those, in all of those ways, knowing they're trying to get through a thing so that it can be better for their family and their kids. So when I see people slogging through some tough stuff and coming out on the other side of it, or coming out of it with such love, grace, and dignity and integrity and resiliency, it swells my heart and it fills my cup, and it just makes me go, okay, you know what, whatever I was freaking out about, I can put that aside now, because I am so now motivated, and my things just seems more petty, and now I'm just gonna double down and go harder, because these folks have just motivated the heck out of me. What they're doing is so inspirational and hopeful.
Yeah, very good.
And Diane, do you have a question for David?
Well, I love to hear about the project, and it's always, I think we're always asking ourselves, how widespread do we think this approach is, or do we feel like we're swimming upstream, or do you know, and it's, and I mean, we're always hopeful, as David has just pointed out there, you know, asking that question. But I don't know how much you feel this is taken up.
Well, I think we're making, I think if you'd asked me that question in January, I would have said we're making slow progress. I think this year has been so disruptive that it's very difficult to answer it. But I am hopeful that we will come out of the year with much faster progress, because I think we have learned, again, particularly in the first half of the year, perhaps rather than now, we've learned more about our interdependence. We've learned more about what's really, really important, what we value in one another. And we have found that relationships are absolutely critical to that. One of the things we've been doing in the Relationships Project is running what we call an observatory, which is just trying to gather observations. It's not a scientific piece of research. We're just gathering observations from anyone who is willing to send them to us about how relationships are changing. And to try to look beneath that and tease out what we have described as the undercurrents. We published a report about this in July called The Moment We Noticed. And the undercurrents are about the shifts in attitudes and behaviours, which we think could prefigure much more fundamental change in the future. And those are exactly the kinds of things we've been talking about. You know, a shift from being very risk averse to trusting one another much more, a shift from a much more competitive to a much more collaborative kind of lifestyle. We pick out 5, and there's not time to talk about them all. But I think if we could find ways of sustaining those rather than just, as I fear in the UK, our politicians are talking about at the moment, you're just trying to rush back to some idea of normality, which it feels to me like a huge missed opportunity. There's a moment now to create the world anew. So I am enthusiastic to that. It will be born out of a great deal of grief and sadness and pain, but there is an opportunity to build the world anew, I think.
Great. Now I want to move us into kind of the audience questionnaires. Menai Owen Jones has asked, do you think globalization has driven or exacerbated individualism and self-interest?
Can I have a go at that? I think globalization is a consequence of the trends that we've been talking about as much as it is a cause of them. So I think that dominant idea that Diane and I both spoke about a much more competitive approach to one another, I think seeing that idea of self-interest driving forward and creating scale, is one of the driving forces behind globalization. And again, I think we can do it better. I think we can get the benefits of one another, in the way that we are. You could say this is a demonstration of that, really, that we can learn from one another across the world without having to own everything everybody else does and drive a competition around it. So, to my mind, the kind of work we're doing in the Relationships Project isn't about trying to rewind the clock and going back to a point where there wasn't globalization, there wasn't the technology and so on. It is about making the best of where we are now, because there are wonderful aspects of it. But again, it's the point I made earlier about learning how to behave in ways that advance our humanity rather than undermine it, I think is some way behind where what we have the technological capability to do at the moment.
And Benjamin Wong has asked, what advice do you have for relationship trust building virtually, especially with those that we consider to be the other? What kind of exercises, frameworks, platforms for healing? Diane, do you want to try that?
Yeah, I saw that in the chat and I was thinking about it. I mean, I went, where that question took me was to medicine wheel teachings, and I'm in Anishinaabe in the prairies, and so we do have this thing called the medicine wheel, which is a circle and there's 4 quadrants, and any sort of really good learning experience should strive to have those 4 things in balance to some degree. Again, I think dominant paradigms or Western paradigms tend to focus on one quadrant, which is the intellectual quadrant, and so we sit in meetings and we, go at the ideas intellectually. The other three quadrants of the paradigm are physicality. And so paying attention to the physical. And so for me, that means a lot of not just sitting at a desk, but getting out onto the land, say, like sitting around a fire, for instance, or walking through the forest or being in the water. You know, personally, I tried to have meetings in the water, you know, like happened to be out at this retreat place and they wanted us to sort of sit in this physical indoor space. And I just went, nah, we're all going out into the water. We're going to go sit out there and have the meeting out there, which really made people go, okay, so I can't bring my phone, or I can't bring my laptop, or I can't bring the paper. Like it made people shift and go, oh, those ways that I usually sit in a meeting, I can't anymore. And so it made us go stand in water and have a conversation and just connect in a different way than had we been sitting around a table with our computers and our pen and paper. So paying attention to physicality, I think COVID is, like, I have moved now more to going on my phone on the meetings, putting the earbuds in and walking while those meetings are happening. Like, how many meetings can I do that? And I think I see that happening a bit more now. And so can we set up the meeting so that we're all walking at the same time? Or, you know, again, you can physically distance when you're outside. I think what the science is telling us at this point is when you're in a confined space for an extended period of time with other people, that's when COVID spreads the fastest. When you're in open spaces with airflow and outdoor, that's where COVID spreads the slowest. And so can we set ourselves up for that stuff? You know, the other quadrants are emotional, and then spiritual. And so I always say in our get-togethers, you know, if there's no emotion, if we're just only straight in the head, if someone's not laughing or crying or pounding the table or, you know, expressing some kind of emotion, you know, we've failed our meeting here. You know, so again, we talk about some indigenous paradigms are 7 ways of healing, and so healing is all about laughing and crying and expressing and sweating and, you know, different things like that. And then there's spiritual, and I don't mean religion. It's not about religion. It's about belief in sort of higher powers, or belief in things that are bigger than us. And so, you know, and often that gets expressed as sort of the hope or the vision, or, you know, the purpose of us getting together. Like, what is it that we're ultimately trying to achieve here, right? That's usually something that's bigger than each of us individually. And so I think about using a medicine wheel approach in my connecting with people, whether that's on Zoom or otherwise. And so, because the ways that we used to connect, this, you know, we can't quite do that anymore. And again, we're always going to follow all the science and the health officials and what they tell us to do, and their recommendations or their advice to us. But I think about, we probably could do more in-person things if we followed, you know, some of these different knowledge systems and did different, like, again, I'm saying, like, let's not all just sit in a boardroom with our, you know, in a closed indoor space. So yeah, and you know, and David had said that, you know, what if we just did this, or we just did that? And I know in our school systems, there was a couple of people who said, what if we just put the desks in a circle? Like, what would that do? Like, if you just think about that a little bit, like, what would that do? That would make us change some things. Yeah, so that's where I went to with that. Again, it's not trying to come up with all the answers, but there's just one offering.
I think your point, well, all of that is I absolutely agree with that, but the point about putting the chairs in a circle, we have a very gladiatorial parliament in the UK, and angry and much of the time unproductive discussion, which again, I think influences political discourse across the country. And our chamber is based on that sort of gladiatorial combat. So on either side, facing one another very close, you know, like two opposing armies. You know, I think one of the ways in which we build better relationships is simply to move the chairs. You know, just think about that differently. What would happen to the conversation if they weren't organized in two different sides? They were organized in a circle, and you could sit wherever you like. And that's a sort of particularly picturesque example, and perhaps a silly one, but you can see it very clearly, I think, in lots of aspects of life. And then just going back to Benjamin's question, just two reflections on that. So if I may, that I think this has, again, it's been a year of very rapid learning. And I think possibly in January, I would have said that online is never going to be as good as face-to-face. But there's been some very interesting observations on the observatory of people. One sticks in my mind, a woman saying that she hadn't been to the synagogue for 5 years. But she's confined to home, and she'd been pretty much forgotten by that community. Suddenly she's been remembered because worship has all moved online, and they've got prayer groups online and teaching online and so on. And so she's come back into that community. And as a result of making those relationships, again, people have brought around food, and you know, they've established a physical connection as well. And you know, I think that sort of shows the best of what we can learn from the online, not how we just do that, but how we blend the digital, the online work with the face-to-face connection. One other thing we've noticed on the observatory is how people who have been receiving services like counselling, for instance, and that having now moved online, and some people say that they found that it's very comfortable, they can sit in their own home, they can have a cup of tea, they have a different and more relaxed conversation. Others have said about exactly the same service, I feel this is an intrusion on my privacy, it breaks confidentiality, I feel uncomfortable with it. So I think recognizing that it isn't either or, it isn't face-to-face or online, it's about a blend, and every relationship is different. And for statutory services and even organizations like our own, much smaller ones, we've got to think much more carefully about how we cater for a wide variety of different kinds of needs and different kinds of relationships.
You know, if I could, David, I want to add one thing to, as you were talking, the thing that came to my mind. Some of our, you know, having to move to an online platform, some of our families that really guide and drive the Boldness Project, we call them our parent guide group. Many of our parent guide group don't have lots of physical space in their homes, and they don't have a quiet corner, you know, to have a very intellectual discussion. Instead, the cat is walking across the screen. The kid is like, you can hear the kid sort of clinging to mom's leg, you know, saying, "Mommy, mommy, mommy," and you know, and then the teenager walks by, or like the whole family dynamic is in the screen, and I love it. And it's you know, when you think about when we gather together and have conversations, there was a time when it was way more natural for us to have the children in the room, or have the families in the room, or have your whole, you know, holistic kind of environment in the conversations. And so when did we move to this sort of pristine or way of communicating?
I have one final question from my colleague, and I think you both have 1 minute to answer this question. But what would the world look like in 10 years if every government, company, big institutions put relationship focus at the center of their approach? What would the world look like?
Better. I think we would be more productive. I mean, I think this isn't a fluffy extra, which I think a lot of politicians and perhaps other leaders think it is. I think it is fundamental to building a world where we have more respect for one another, more respect for the natural environment, and we are a more efficient and happier people.
Yeah, I immediately just, again, it sounds so Pollyanna, but I immediately went to, we would probably feel a lot more love. We'd probably feel a lot more peace. We'd probably feel a lot more happiness. There'd probably be a lot more good wellness. Yeah, like that's how I really firmly believe that when we center a relationship, those are the things that, you know, the outcomes.
Great. Thank you so much, Diane and David. It's been an honor and really humbling experience to have this conversation with you today. And thank you everyone who joined us today. I wish everyone a good afternoon, good morning, and good evening. And thank you for joining us today. And